Okay, hello, and welcome to this Devex conversation here on LinkedIn called Getting Past Business as Usual, What 2024 Holds for Climate and Food System Finance. My name is Honesty Pern, and I'm the Opinions Editor at Devex, a news organization covering global development. At the end of 2023, Devex published a series of opinion articles with predictions for the year ahead in global development, written by professionals in the field. And today I'm joined by three authors from the series, whom it was my pleasure to work with, and who are experts in climate, food systems, and global development. For people listening in, the articles are listed in the event description, and feel free to drop your comments in throughout the discussion. So first, let me introduce my guests. We have Clare Shakya. You are the Global Managing Director of Tackling Climate at the Nature Conservancy, where you've recently moved from the International Institute for Environment and Development. And prior to that, you worked at the UK Department for International Development. And welcome. It's such an honor to have you here today. I'm also joined by Yamikani Idriss, Environmental Officer with Malawi's Ministry of Natural Resources and Climate Change. And Yamikani, you're also the lead climate transparency negotiator for Malawi and LDCs and a technical expert reviewer under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So a big task. Welcome. And I'd like to mention that Clare and Yamikani, in fact, co-authored one of the articles in our prediction series. So they have worked together extensively. And the headline of that piece is, "The climate finance system must be faster, simpler, and locally led." And last but not least, I'm pleased to have Dhanush Dinesh here today, founder and chief climate catalyst of Clim-Eat, a think and do tank that aims to accelerate food systems transformation under climate change. Your prediction piece for our series was entitled Embrace Disruptive Solutions for a Sustainable Food System, which I'm looking forward to digging into more today. Welcome, Dhanush. So I'd like to set the scene somewhat for our audience with some big picture questions for each of you. And we will possibly lose Yamikani, but he will hopefully be coming back. So I'll start with you, Clare. How would you describe the current state of global climate finance?
Thanks. So at the moment, we are trying to still meet the earlier promise of 100 billion a year. In the run up to COP last year, that the donors estimated they were about there now, and I would now try and exceed that. But what we're finding is that for the poorest countries and communities, it's very hard to access. So a lot of climate finance is going to the easier areas to finance, which tends to be in the emerging economies, and it does tend to mostly focus on the energy transition, which of course is absolutely vital. But given the scale of climate impacts that we're already seeing, the way that these climate impacts are accumulate, so you're getting cumulative impacts because each year something else is happening, and it becomes harder and harder to respond to, and countries are getting deeper and deeper into debt. The need to really refocus the finance on supporting the very poorest countries and the very poorest communities is absolutely critical. I'll just add actually that a lot of the finance has also been on sort of big national projects and on planning processes, and actually for society to transform, we know that when you're looking at the long-term strategies of countries in Europe, in the UK, in the US, and so on, a lot of the action has to happen at the local level. So we need to see much more of that finance getting down to the local level, and really we're still seeing the vast majority of it in very sort of top-down, large project type approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll keep the follow-up for Yamikani for that, specifically on that local level. But Dhanush, for you as a food system expert and activist, why are the food and agricultural systems so important in the area of climate finance, and what are some of the major challenges that you've seen facing those today in terms of financing?
Thanks, Honesty. In terms of the significance of food systems for climate change, there's two reasons mainly. A third of all emissions comes from food systems, and associated activities. So, right from the deforestation to expand agriculture production in some places to fertilizer production or food loss and waste. So, the whole series of activities which takes place to produce, distribute, and consume food that emits emissions, and that's quite significant. But we also need to eat food, so it's we cannot undermine food production systems. And the other aspect is on the resilience of these systems. So the impacts of climate change are also being felt in these systems. These systems are mainly driven by small scale farmers, over 500 million of them, and they are often at the forefront of climate change. So on one hand, food systems is a source of emissions. On the other hand, it's a source of livelihoods which need to be protected as well. So this is why food systems is crucial. So we need to secure food security. We need to enhance the resilience of the farmers who are producing food for us. But at the same time, we need to look at ways in which we can reduce the climate impact, because the current trajectory is kind of breaking the planet.
And specifically in terms of climate finance mechanisms, are there any big pockets that are dedicated to the food and agricultural systems, or are you finding that there's a need there to refocus?
Yeah, I mean, there are various sources of financing that go into the food systems. The amount of climate finance that goes to food systems is quite low. But what I like to focus on is the amount of subsidies that go into agriculture production. It's over $800 billion a year. And these subsidies are crucially important because they support farmers to produce food. But many times the subsidies go for the wrong things in terms of climate change. So it might be subsidizing fossil fuel use or fertilizers, inorganic fertilizers, so things like that. So I'm not saying that we need to get rid of this amount of money. That's not possible. But can we think more cleverly on how we use this resource, still give it to farmers, but tailor the outcomes differently so that we're also getting environmental and climate related outcome. So yes, we can say we don't have enough money, but that's not a good argument, because we have this whole source of funding which we need to rethink how we use.
Thanks. Yeah, that's fascinating. And Yamikani, I hope you can hear us. How can climate finance tools or mechanisms be designed to ensure equity and justice, especially for vulnerable communities in low-income countries or SIDS, which I understand is your area of expertise?
Yeah, thank you very much, Honesty. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, so indeed, climate finance is the backbone of climate justice, because most of the vulnerable countries, including the LDC and SIDS, are suffering due to climate change, which they didn't cause. So our colleagues are developed today because of their development processes, which they undergone and which resulted into emissions, and now they're developed. But for us, we didn't need to consider low emission development because we are really impacted. So making sure that this finance is well designed to respond to the needs of these vulnerable countries is the first step for climate justice. So let's design the climate architecture to make sure that it really responds to the priorities and the needs of the vulnerable countries. And when we say that, it means it has to come from the bottom. Communities from the vulnerable countries, including the LDC and SAIDs, have to identify their pathways to adaptation and resilience. They have to identify their priorities, which can help them adapt to climate change impacts. That's the starting point, not imposing. And then we have to make those resources available to them to implement those priorities. And the resources has to be adequate enough. Not just adequate, but also accessible. So we have to look at the entire value chain of the delivery of the climate finance and design programs which could really change the business, the way we have been doing the business previously. And now we have good examples like the Life AR, which is being championed by the LDCs. It's a baby of the LDCs themselves. They sat down to design the program, the Least Developed Country Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience. In abbreviation, we call it Life AR. So this responds to the needs of the LDCs and their commitments from both the LDCs and the development partners who are supporting. And in that sense, it has strong ownership, and it is having what we call principles. For example, it is targeting 70% of resources to reach the communities, because that's what we need. We should not just work around the figures. Even if the developed countries achieve the 100 billion goal for climate finance, but if it doesn't reach to the communities where it is needed most, then nothing has been done. So we have to really look at the entire architecture of climate finance and deliver it in the way that it responds to the needs in sense of agency and it's accessible to the communities who needs it most. I can respond like that for now. Thank you.
Thanks. And yeah, in your article that you and Claire co-authored, you mentioned something that for me does fit in that business as usual box, about the Green Climate Fund, which is the self-described largest climate fund that we have, and it's a multi-country operation. So. And we know that just writing funding proposals for that fund is a huge strain on organizations. We've recently reported on the fund's simplified approval process being far from simple. So I don't know, Claire or Yamikani, in your view, a big beast like the GCF, how can that be more fit for purpose? And how can new funds that are being set up, like the Loss and Damage Fund recently, learn from the mistakes so that those percentages of resources do reach the local level without too much work and time?
I'll jump in then. I was giving Yamikani the chance for the first response, but I mean, basically, that is a huge problem, and Yamikani can give examples of so many countries taking 4, 5, 6, 7 years to get through all the hoops of accreditation, project development, and application, and then a whole set of steps to actually get the first disbursement. So one of the things that the LDC group, working with the small island developing states, and a group of progressive champions from the donor side are working together around the Climate and Development Ministerial, is a long-term strategy. They just all signed up to a shared vision at the last COP, where they're planning to put into place the reforms that are needed so that process can eventually take maybe as little as 6 months. So instead of each country going through this enormously time-consuming process and it taking so long to get the funding approved that actually the needs may well have changed because climate is affecting the systems, food, water, society systems so rapidly now that you can't wait 7 years for the funding to start to flow and expect that program to still make sense. Yamikani also mentioned the Life AR, and those types of approaches are more that building the mechanisms for long-term support to the frontline, to the communities who are facing climate impacts. By building those delivery mechanisms, locally led approaches, it's hoped that actually the GCF might then begin to be able to put funding in once it's supporting a program like that in the long term. So it becomes something that can be replicated year after, every funding cycle can re-support that, rather than each country having to come up with yet another project and yet another justification, but actually to continue these long-term national strategies. But Yamikani, I'm sure you've got something to say on this one as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's indeed a very important question, and Clare has responded very well. And to just emphasize the importance of the GCF to really do better in terms of responding to the agency which is outside here. It should not be a competition of writing, but it rather should be the competition of responding to the agency of the impacts which communities are experiencing. Because the LDCs and SEEDs really have low capacity to reach the level which the GCF wants in terms of the quality of the project. So we have to focus now on the intended purpose of the fund. So the fund was made to respond to the needs of the communities, to respond to the adverse impacts of climate change, and not to have like a competition in writing the proposals. So as Clare has mentioned, we are working hard with a group of progressive countries under the CDM, and we are happy to see the GCF also coming forth and other funding agencies who joins the meetings under the CDM to understand the problems which we are facing as LDCs and SEEDs, as well as the solutions which are being proposed on how best we can reduce the delays in disbursement, as well as in getting the approvals. So we are hoping that they will be doing the long-term proposals which are being put forward. Despite every year you hear at the COPs, the GCF decision always has the same outcomes to say simplify, please do better, simplify, but the actual speed in simplifying the access is lacking. So we need to use all the platforms to work together with the GCF to make sure that they do better in terms of quickly approving the proposals, as well as making sure that the disinvestments also takes place in time. Thank you.
Yeah, and just for our audience, CDM is the Climate and Development Ministerial, which is part of the COP process, and which Malawi was a co-chair for leading up to COP 28. Yeah, just that's correct, right, Yamikani? And so talking
yes,
of
it's
COP,
correct. And under the CDM, we have. Yeah, so I was saying that's correct. And under the CDM, we have several like goals which we want to achieve. And Malawi is championing one of the goals, which is to do with access. So that's goal number 2. So we want to champion access. And in there's also other countries, including the UK and others who want to together to champion the access to climate finance, and that deals with the subject matter we are discussing here on how we can simplify and access. And on that, we are ambitiously targeting that within 6 months, we have to make sure that proposals are approved, as well as the disbursement takes place. So we want to try to talk with the funding agencies, including the GCF, to ease the access of the funds. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And yeah, so talking of COP, Dhanush, I know that you, well, in the pieces I've worked on with you, you are fairly skeptical of big development meetings, but you do see the need to attend in a certain way and how those meetings can move the needle a little bit. In terms of food systems at COP, there was a food day and there was a declaration on sustainable agriculture and resilient food systems and climate. But to me, this seemed, again, to be very much focused on policy and good intentions and business as usual, rather than laying out some concrete financing pathways. Is that a fair assessment, or are there some financing mechanisms that have come out of that we can look to 2024 for realization?
So maybe try to answer the question in parts, honesty. So as you mentioned, COP28 was a big moment for food systems. So there was this declaration which has been signed by about 160 heads of state. So it gives a really a high priority to food systems. So that was great. The problem is that that's kind of happening under the umbrella of the presidency. At the same time, we don't see within the actual negotiations that this is being reflected. So there might be good intentions outside of the formal process, but that's not being reflected inside the formal process. And that's a little bit why I'm a bit skeptical. I'll be very happy to be more optimistic if I could see the results emerging from these good intentions. And this is not just in the case of the UAE. I've sort of been going to COP since COP21, and I've seen this over and over again. And we need to be honest and have a conversation about that. To answer your question now about financing, so against this declaration, there were several financial commitments also announced at the COP from the UAE as well as other funders. So, which is a good sign, because very often what I've seen is like at a COP, a presidency announces a new initiative, and next year there's a new presidency, so suddenly this initiative kind of goes on the shelf and nobody really takes it seriously anymore or funds it or anything. So this year it seems to be different because there's been money announced to support the ambitions of the declaration. But I have two concerns about it. One is the volume of funding. It's not nowhere close to the scale of the challenge. So I don't think we're talking about hundreds of millions here. That's not going to solve the food system challenge. So it's a good sign. Maybe it helps to follow up on these good intentions and declaration, but it's nowhere near the financing that's needed to solve the challenges in food systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And to those concrete numbers, Claire, I wanted to come back to what you mentioned at the beginning around the mitigation and adaptation divide. So mitigation is a much more attractive field for private investors. It's easier to invest in a solar panel plant than to think about adaptation at community level. And as you mentioned, a lot of it is going to emerging economies. So how do you make locally led adaptation attractive to catalyze more private funding instead of it going to mitigation?
Well, private funding is particularly hard in the adaptation space because a lot of what you need to do, or a lot of the most cost-effective things you might do on adaptation, are public goods. They don't provide returns. They provide a flow of benefits, a package of benefits to those who are in the local area. As a result, it has been generally much harder to get private investment in. There are elements of supporting enterprise, for example, to increase their resilience to adaptation. Actually, also increases the reliability of their supply to markets, and also can reduce emissions at the same time. So you could have the big corporates ensuring that their supply chains are invested in ways that increase the resilience that would actually really support small scale farmers in all sorts of different localities. But in most of the poorest countries, they are very small markets. They're small economies and therefore not as much interest to big investors. They're considered to have high country risk. So they're seen as a poor bet and not poor returns, because even if you invest in getting to know the country, building your networks there, that will reduce your country risk, the market's small. So there's a lot there to unpick. And the development partners, the donors, have been saying since the 100 billion was promised that large proportion of that will come from the private sector. And whilst that's more or less true in the emission space, in the energy decarbonisation processes, it's still a long way from happening in the rest of the field. So the land use and adaptation areas are much further behind. There's been a lot of initiatives over the years to try and, with a focus on food systems or on forestry or on adaptation, that tend to be quite sort of superficial. And with, as Dhanush has been saying, a lot of good intentions, a lot of fine words, but then the corporates themselves or the big investors are really struggling to follow through. And so we do need to start to look at the ways this whole system works, so that we're focused much more, get the public finance much more on that upstream work to shift the rules, the regulation, the policy, and to build the platforms that can aggregate, bring in private finance more effectively at bigger deal sizes. And that might be in some locations at a regional level. For example, if you've got lots of small island states with small economies, it might make more sense to create a platform at the regional level. And also to design and incubate and prove out the value of different approaches, whether that's support to small enterprise or whether that's investing in those public goods that will reduce climate impacts in different locations. And that's really where this sort of locally led adaptation process comes in. If we can build the mechanisms that support places, enterprise and households in sort of social protection, welfare type approaches, then through those three channels, you can begin to really shift society on a number of levels. But one final aspect of this is, so you've got to change the rules of the game, you've got to design and incubate those delivery mechanisms. But the third area is also improving decision support tools. Because adaptation is complex, because weather is uncertain, you need fairly robust analysis that helps identify options, engage stakeholders around those options, and really begin to understand also how to finance, how to sequence the financing layers and create the opportunities for getting to scale. And all of those areas actually take time. And because climate's been so urgent, people haven't been particularly patient. In development sector, I think there has been a history of programs being funded for 7-10 years. In climate, they tend to be 2, 3, 4 years. So we just need to start to accept that, patience is much greater. Patience is needed in the private sector. Patient capital also tends to be 4 or 5 years, and that's patient. Actually, what we need is sort of 10-year timeframes to build the systems and the delivery mechanisms that can really shift society at the speed and scale that we need.
Thanks. And so, Dhanush, taking those 3 points from Clare, in terms of of food systems innovations, and you mentioned in your opinion article also new philanthropic initiatives going into the financing for food systems. Are those areas that you're seeing in your work? You also listed like a number of innovations that you expect to see scale up in 2024. How would you respond to Claire's points from a food and agricultural systems perspective?
Yeah, so just take a step back first. The food system works, or any system works, in the way that it does for a particular number of reasons. So in terms of innovation, we might be producing certain kind of seeds, a certain kind of fertilizers, because over history there's been reasons why we prioritize those things. And it's the same, like if we're giving subsidies, there is a particular reason why every subsidy was agreed upon and signed and is being provided. So if we want to be what Claire said about rethink the game, then we need to think about why was this in place, and think about how do we unlock it. Or we can be disruptive and we can bring in new solutions to the table. So that's a bit what I argue with, because the current incumbent system is like really entrenched and it's very hard to shift it. So can we also think about what are the new things that's out there? And how can we actually help get them to scale? So then that has an effect on the incumbent system as well, because they have to kind of react to the disruptors. But just to give a tangible example, what we did was we were looking at technologies which can be really game changing for food systems. And so this is not something like the big companies or big organizations are talking about, but just looking at what are scientists and universities innovating on, what are new startups working on. We looked at 3 different domains and we found about 240 of them. So it just shows the huge promise that's out there in terms of innovation. But these companies or researchers, innovators, they don't have the advocacy departments and marketing and communications to bring them to a COP setting. So we have to go looking for them. They're not going to come and find the policymakers. But once we found them, then what we've been trying to understand is what are the factors that can help them get to scale, and how do we help them in that pathway. And that's not possible for Clim-Eat as a small organization. We're a startup just 2 years and 10 days old. But we need to have the resources, the investors, the policymakers who are willing to support that transition. And this is where I find a great promise, because there are new players in the system. There are new philanthropic funders who are putting money into non-traditional areas, which is really encouraging, because more money to the same things is not going to solve the problem. So you need to think about what are the new areas and invest and be bold enough to do that. So we are seeing that. We are also seeing interest from the private sector as well. So like when the disruptors are growing, you can see that the well-established players, they're also looking at, okay, how can we either incorporate this or buy this company, things like that. So that's kind of, there's a lot of action happening beneath the surface, and that gives me a lot of hope and inspiration, because that's also happening quite fast.
Thanks. Yeah, and for me, there's an interesting sort of tension as well when you talk about disruption and innovation, and to me, that's a very Silicon Valley moonshot type language. I'd love to hear from Yamikani. Is this something that at the, for example, the Climate and Development Ministerial CDM level, is this sort of innovation and entrepreneurship at the local level being heard by the big climate negotiators and like the presidencies of groups like COP?
Yeah, thank you very much. And indeed, that extends to the response from Clare on how can we have meaningful engagements with the private sector in adaptation. So the only way in least developed countries and the most developed countries have meaningful engagement with the private sector is to have the private sector empower the local entrepreneurs, the local innovations, and that will have a good engagements with the private sector. And indeed, when we are talking about the private sector within the negotiations, it will not raise the fear, because the current state, when you hear the private sector negotiations to a vulnerable country like Malawi and other LDCs, it brings an alarm, because it's like, oh, the private sector, for example, when you hear the private finance from the public, it's like, oh no, it will be more burden. It will bring more loans. It means more loans to just a layman. When we just hear the private sector, when the developed countries say, no, we need also to include the private sector finance, it brings an alarm automatically. So it brings like a red line to most of the vulnerable countries, because we are afraid of the private sector that instead of bringing the good as the current state, they bring the bad in terms of more loans, the modalities which they use. So the way now to approach systematically, bring on board the private sector is what Danish and Clare said, to empower the local private sector. Let's build a local private sector which will then help us to systematically respond to climate change adaptation and resilience building. And that means to use the innovations which are existing out there, use the local skills, the local entrepreneurs, the local medium and small scale businesses within the local context. We should not think of the private sector being from the developed countries as always. So we have to think about the private sector being in-house within the vulnerable countries. So they should be empowered, and that's through the innovations and the entrepreneurship within those countries. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to we'll be coming up to time soon, and I'd like to end on sort of a high note. And I'd like to hear from each of you something that you are excited about, or always maybe a resolution for you to work on for the year to come, in terms of your work area and how that might intersect with climate and food systems financing. Dhanush, I see you thinking. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I'm still in thinking mode, but this is a bit of a reflection as well, coming from the COP and those kind of meetings. So, where I would personally like to move, and for Clim-Eat to move, is actually getting things done. We have a system where we are, the incentives are, to turn up at the big meetings and talk about all the great things we're doing, but can we shift that into actually supporting the countries or the entrepreneurs who are in need of the technical support or financial support which we can provide? So what we have been thinking about is kind of shifting our area of work into actually the delivery piece. And how we're thinking about it is, I use the example of a technology, but it could be an entrepreneur, anything. So try and understand what are the factors which can help get these to scale. So it could be financial things, it could be technical support, it could be linking to venture capital, or it could be a number of things. So we want to be mapping what are those things in particular countries. We'll be working in 5 countries this year. And then how can we help on those lines? Just us going and starting a small pilot project is not going to help many people. So my resolution for this year is to focus really on results and deliver those results.
Thanks. And what about you, Yamikani?
Yeah, thank you very much, Honesty, for that question. Yeah, so 2024 it's a very important year, as we had a landmark decision last year on global stock take. So it will be a very important year to follow up on the outcomes of the first global stock take under the Paris Agreement. Since the signing of the Paris Agreement 2015, this one was the first of its kind. So if you look at the outcomes of the global stock take, you will really find the gaps which are there, and there are also opportunities for the world to take an approach which could help us to achieve the 1.5. So as a seasoned negotiator myself, 2024 is very key because we don't have much time. The time is now to start implementing the resolution we agreed, the next steps, the way forward within the group stock take. As you saw, beginning with the mitigation, we had quite good decision within the mitigation. Of course, not enough, but it provides a good starting point. And then we have to start following up on those. In terms of scaling up on finance, we also had a decision with Global Stocktake on scaling up the finance, and on doubling of finance on adaptation is also within there. So there are quite a lot of opportunities for the vulnerable countries, including Malawi, to follow up. So what will be key is to not just leave that ambitious outcome like that. So we have to put it into implementation. As Dinesh has said, we went there, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of talk about the UAE consensus, and then now what's next? So the next thing is to follow up on that. So I'll be keen to see 2024 moving things around to make sure that the dream and the goal under the Paris Agreement is put back on track. Thank you.
Thank you. And Claire.
Well, I guess as Yamikani says, the global stocktake is now complete, and we're looking now at the run up to the next moment of ambition for all the countries to update their climate strategies, their climate plans, the NDCs, national determined contributions. Deadline's March 25, so not long away, actually, just over a year. And it's a real opportunity to strengthen locally led approaches, use those to inform spatial planning about what priorities to do where, and get the financing in place and really think about those layers of finance that come in from public and private and how it gets sequenced to really begin to mobilize the trillions, not the billions. So given all of that, I guess the what 2024 holds for me would be really, the sorts of initiatives that Yamikani's involved in with Life AR and with the Climate and Development Ministerial, those all need masses of support, connecting what's happening globally in coalitions with practice on the ground and making sure that all the systems along the way in the pipeline, as it were, get strengthened is essential for really driving the future ambition. But also making sure that the decision support tools are there for those countries to think this through and understand, with the very best science there is, how to decide between options and how to work with their stakeholders to engage and think about what their long-term vision to thrive is, so that it's not just about survival, it's about thriving. And now that I'm at the Nature Conservancy, we have a lot of tools looking at how these can be applied, what might be most relevant, and how to really get them in the service of these sorts of processes of Life AR or the Climate and Development Ministerial to help really drive the system to ambition at much greater speed. But so it's going to be a busy year for all of us, I think.
No, and it's incredible to hear your different perspectives, because I feel like you represent the spectrum. Dhanush sort of at that innovation level, Yamikani from the vulnerable communities perspective, Clare at the kind of high picture. So yeah, it's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much for your time, all of you, and I look forward to watching your work from afar in the next few months. Thanks so much, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you so much, Honesty.
Thank you, Honesty.
Thanks, Dhanush, Yamikani.
Thanks.